You cannot win the war against the world if you can't win the war against your doubts. You might want to become aware of your internal chatterbox. Like, instead of doing this, oh, I'm such a fraud, I'm such a loser. Are you really? Because you don't have to be. I had two habits that were always a telltale sign for something's wrong in Wendy's life. I would spend weeks spending hours every day at home just watching Netflix, and I would spend money that I didn't have eating food that wasn't good for me. It was almost like a way for me to zone out and escape my real life. And we do the exact same thing with video games, by the way, and we do the exact same thing with YouTube, by the way. That. Succumbing to that voice that you know isn't good for you becomes the pattern that you repeat when you feel like you're worse than a nobody. You cannot win the war against the world if you can't win the war against your doubts. When you feel like you have no worth, when you feel like the universe despises you, when you feel fraudulent, you delay your feelings, but it's only temporary. And so, let's see, write down your goals. What are the boundaries with my time? What do you want to do? What do you want to achieve? Be unrealistic in the beginning so that you can see it. Figure out what you need to do for your world in terms as if you were actually doing that shit. You cannot win the war against the world if you can't win the war against your doubts. When I was a kid, look, I've always had this tragic, compelling, nasty, charismatic little internal critic. And I didn't know I had one. And when I finally noticed I had one, when I got honest about what she was saying to me, oh, I was ready to believe her. But you cannot win the war against the world if you can't win the war against your doubts. At my age, at 38, with my life experiences behind me and my mental illness and my distaste for unnecessary self-harm, I have a small problem on my hands if I want to believe her. So if you were to listen to her, right, and think, okay, well, if a year from now I kept believing her, what would your day-to-day life look like? Ew! And you can get very clear that you're not committed to that. And then you can stop beating yourself up for the shit you never deserved to hear, right? So, what I realized is that I can do an hour a day of walking and my mind is steady. And my inner critic needs to go right back to teacher training school because even though she's on my side, she is a shitty teacher. And I'm good. Yes, it works. You cannot win the war against the world if you can't win the war against your doubts. So you might want to become aware of the internal critic in your head who's abusing you like a shitty but well-meaning first grade teacher. Like, instead of doing this, oh, you're not paying enough attention. You need to sit down and shut up. Do you really? Because you need to stand up and lift your voice. You actually can. Look at all the idiots that are making noise. You can make noise, but you're gonna have to roll the clock forward just a year and say, okay, if I'm able to send that internal critic back to teaching school, I'm able to make friends with my internal narrative. I'm able to finally freaking love myself. What do I need to be doing a year from now to make that happen? And what are those traits that are there a year from now that I don't have right now? And then slide yourself back here to this minute, this second, and start right here, right now. You cannot win the war against the world if you can't win the war against your doubts. Do I actually believe that I'm a champion? No. Do I want to go confront my deepest fears right now? Nope. Am I willing to believe that I have worth? Nope. I know that I'm a loser. My life is a wreck. and my hairstyle sucks. But so bring it back. And then you have this process for making a change that starts right now. You send your internal critic back to teaching school. You cannot win the war against the world if you can't win the war against your doubts. You teach her how to multiply your good points and lovingly, understandingly correct your bad habits or misinformation without shame, without blame, without scorn, with love, with understanding, with empathy, with grace. And then you back your luscious little butt up right here, right now, and you decide, I'm going to win the war against my mind. You cannot win the war against the world if you can't win the war against your doubts. And if you're willing, then effing blast through all the terrible, shaming thoughts, scared, crying, shaking thoughts that are going to be there when you grab your internal critic by the nape of her neck and shove her into teacher training. That's how you do it. And you have the reality check like I had, which is like, oh shit, I'm not that bad after all. This inner voice is going to change. Let's get all of the shame and blame and self-loathing out of the room. And let's focus on the things that you know are actually true.